I think perhaps there's no better person to tell you about what happens in a community like a city when disruption occurs. We've asked Charles Ruthizer to come here from Baltimore. He's with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. He's with their Center for Community and Economic Opportunity. His next book will be a book about leadership, which will come out in the spring. And we thought it would be a good thing to follow Peter with somebody who asked the question, what happens when those disruptions in supply and those shocks in price show up in our neighborhoods? Charles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much, Gordon. I'm not a tech guy. I'm a people guy. I have to be honest with you, I have a very deeply ambivalent relationship to technology, especially digital technology. As you can see, this is just that's my one and only slide. And but some of what I've heard today and yesterday excites me, thrills me. A bunch of other things scare me, worry me. I'm deeply concerned. A few things actually, I want to say repulse is too kind of a strong a word, but really deeply worry me because I have a feeling that our technical mastery of some of the basic elements and principles of the universe, our ability to integrate the physical and digital world, have given us a false sense about how we can predict and control our various kinds of social worlds. That's just laying that out there. That's my particular kind of bias. I was trained as a cultural anthropologist. I've been in philanthropy for 10 years, but I used to be a university professor, a big critic of urban development, how cities got built, before I realized I had to be part of the solution rather than just saying why something shouldn't work, and figure out how you actually go about doing it. But it's been very difficult to sort of shake my professional training. It's given me an interest not only in social organization, but in language and systems of ideas, belief, metaphors, especially metaphors, the power of metaphors to shape thinking. I almost went rogue today, sitting and listening to all the metaphors that were flying fast and furious yesterday. I restrained myself and wanted to talk to you about a concept that a lot of people are talking about these days, and that's the concept of resilience. I didn't really hear it very much over the last 2 days, though. I was a bit surprised. This maybe is a population that hasn't been infected by that particular idea virus yet. But there are a lot of folks, a lot of very smart people who are talking about the concept. The Rockefeller Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, New America, Cisco, the Federal Reserve Bank. There's lots of folks in the national security space, the Department of Homeland Security, HUD, are all talking about the need for resilience. And part of my job at the Casey Foundation, is a really fun part of my job, is to track these new ideas that come out into the world, that circulate within the networks of powerful thought leaders and decision makers that get translated into policies and practices, get implemented on the ground, and then have a whole set of consequences, not just the results we seek to attain, but the unintended consequences that come from our actions. And maybe it's because I've read a lot of dystopian science fiction as a kid and as a young adult and still, but this sense of this vision of the technologically smart city of the future really worries me because I think we're taking a lot of things for granted. And we are sort of being a little sort of blind to some of the very deep vulnerabilities we're creating by creating these vast, highly complicated, robust, yet extremely fragile systems. So the whole discourse on resilience now is talking about how we can respond to vulnerability. I think events in the United States over the last 10 years have made us acutely sort of vulnerable to thinking about vulnerability. 9/11, Katrina, the 2008 crash have all made us sort of think about just how perilously close to the precipice we are on many things and how we have taken things for granted. So there's this big emphasis, especially on those people who design and think about very formal and deep metabolic systems of cities and nations like transportation, electricity, to figure out ways in which we can make these systems able to respond to disruptive change, things that can't be anticipated, continue to function and go back to the baseline and so forth. And there's this whole notion of being able to engineer or architect resilience of these vast systems. And it's great. We could think about redundancy, we could think about modularity, we could think about creating all these different kinds of feedback loops that help tell us when things might be going off the rails and how we can adaptively respond. But there's another very important part to resilience, and it's not planned at all. And in some ways, it's really, a common thread through the history of human civilization. And that is the ability of systems, particularly social systems, systems of people, to self-organize and adaptively respond to change, not by just bouncing back to a previous state, but bouncing forward and dynamically reorganizing. And it's that piece that I think is so very compelling about resilience. But one of my observations of the literature, and I have a whole reading list that's appended to the website. So if those of you who have not read it, there's loads of things, very interesting literature to read, has been sort of sneaking this notion of engineering resilience into this notion of complex adaptive systems. It's somehow figuring out how we can sort of hardwire human societies to be adaptive. And there's lots of issues with that. There's lots of problems, and it's a sort of thing that just sort of pops up and comes along. But in general, I'm a big fan of the resilience discussion. I think it provides a very new way to sort of reframe old debates, to help us get out of some sort of dead-end polarities and ways of thinking. And really, there should be a question mark after next big innovation, because I think the jury is still out as to whether or not resilience thinking is going to be part of this. One of the key things, though, and this is the most challenging part here, is that the thinking of resilience has been largely talked of as within a scientific paradigm. And it ignores the fact that resilience is also a value. And there are some authors, particularly Andrew Zolli and Anne-Marie Healy in their book, that talk about resilience being the next moral quest of the 21st century, which is really, I think, upping the game. But it just sort of begs the question then, what is the relationship between resilience and other kinds of moral imperatives like sustainability or efficiency or profitability? There's been a curious reluctance to acknowledge the presence of a giant system, perhaps one of the most resilient systems, that are systems of belief. If you take a look at, say, world religions, for example, that have lasted 2,000 years, those are examples of belief systems, disembodied to be sure, that have had the power to adapt and change to contemporary circumstances. We need to look at that realm of belief just as well as we're looking at these hard and fast things that we have been talking about over the last 2 days. But my biggest beef with the current discourse on resilience has nothing to do with the concept of resilience. It has to deal with the concept of community. And I do it all the time. You guys do it. I noted 13 instances yesterday where people talked about the community. And it's the sort of thing that drives me kind of nuts. Maybe it's the old college professor in me. But that is a very, very misleading notion, because community is as fuzzy as resilience is, if even not more so. And by referring to community in a certain way as if it was a natural system, a kind of module within a city that we can then try to build resilience of, is, I think, misleading in a couple of senses. One, because communities refer to spatial units on one hand, and planners, politicians, and philanthropy are very guilty of drawing lines on the map all the time, and then making these lines as if they were the boundaries and containers of natural systems. And anyone who's been in the business of community development knows that those lines have very little relationship at times with the social activities that are going on the ground. People go back and forth across those boundaries all the time, and the boundaries that are drawn by official folks do not correspond to the boundaries that exist within people's heads. So there's some fuzziness there that we need to accept and not take this notion that the units that we create are the ones that are there. One of the things that excites me about the new digital technology is that we're no longer going to be a prisoner of census tract and zip code level data. In some cases, these lines get drawn because those are where the census boundaries are. Those are where our data is. The ability to sort of free data from those kinds of constraints, I think, is going to be tremendously empowering. It's going to run into a lot of the inertia, though, of these formal systems that have been created and imposed and are still enshrined in bureaucratic practices. But community as a spatial construct is only one sense of the term. Communities are also social constructs that have nothing to do with space. They are created by race, They're created by religion, interest group, this group here, meeting of the minds. This is a community of a kind. But the key thing about communities is that they are bound not only by boundaries, but by a shared sense of identity. And in many cases, what we're talking about, the communities that we're working with in cities, they're 20, 30, 40, 50,000 people. We have this romanticized notion of communities sometimes that it's a group of relative equality and face-to-face interaction. But in many cases, the things that we're branding as communities are actually little cities unto itself that are fragmented, hierarchical, to a certain extent fixed. And we cannot sort of assume there's this degree of unanimity and shared feeling within them. Finally, though, new technology has this ability to completely reorder the landscape of community. And as Mac McCarthy mentioned yesterday, it can either reaffirm some of these lines, the natural as well as the social and the officially imposed demarcations, but it also can explode them. And it's not quite sure where that's going to happen. But this whole notion of what a city is, I mean, communities are not just at the neighborhood level. The city itself is a kind of community. Some cities have a much greater sense of community. I mean, and there's a way in which identities of cities and ideas about cities are shaped not by scientific discourse, but by the cultural imagination and popular media. I live in Baltimore. I meet someone for the first time, and they go, "Oh, The Wire." And, you know, that sort of thing, if you want to give a, put, a Chamber of Commerce person from Baltimore or a person on the city council and have them twitch all over the place, you mention that. Because it's not a very flattering portrayal of Baltimore. It's a real portrayal of a certain part of Baltimore. It is not the entirety of Baltimore, but, there's truth in fiction, and that fictional series captures the lived reality of many communities, communities that have been isolated from opportunity, communities that are not, plugged into the digital world, and it's going to take a lot to do this. And I think unless we're very intentional about recognizing the unevenness and inequality that exists on the ground within cities, communities, regions, and nations, there's a very real tendency that all this new stuff that we're creating is just going to reinforce and obscure those kinds of connections and inequalities. So I just leave you with that. I'm hoping to provoke a conversation, not necessarily here, at lunch, afterwards via email and via Twitter or so forth, but to really get you thinking, A, about resilience and the literature that's emerged there, as well as how we go about and take for granted notions of community. Thanks.
Fantastic. All without notes.
What?
All without notes.